The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, slipped between a grocery store flyer and an orthodontist reminder. Heavy stock, cream-colored with gold-beveled edges, and a wax seal pressed into the back of. Of course it had a wax seal. That was the Devereaux way tradition, dressed as elegance control, wrapped in charm. I held it in my hands like a lit match, already knowing it would burn before I even opened it. It wasn't addressed to me personally or even to Colby, just the Ainsleys. That told me everything. Still, I opened it. A printed invitation letterpress, no less announcing the 40th anniversary celebration of Alexander and Vivienne Devereaux. An evening to honor legacy, love, and family history, it read in looping cursive. It was signed at the bottom in thick, raised ink. We warmly welcome all branches of the family to attend this special milestone. All branches. That was new. Last time they sent anything, it was to Julian and Cambria Devereaux. Full stop. No mention of me or Rowan or the life that came before Cambria's glossy entrance. I placed the invitation on the counter and stared at it. Behind me, the tea kettle clicked off. I didn't move. Colby walked in a minute later, hair damp from his morning shower shirt, untucked and sleeves already rolled up. "Everything okay?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. I just tilted the invitation toward him. He leaned over to read it, brows lifting slightly. Then, with a half smile, he said, "Well, that's new. I think I'm being rebranded," I muttered, "from ex-wife to historical artifact." He leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand. "We should go." I turned to him, surprised. "You think so? It's Rowan's family, too. He should see the whole picture, even the edited parts." That was Colby, always calm, always steady, a man who believed in truth over comfort, even when it was uncomfortable. He'd spent the last 10 years raising Rowan like his own, never needing recognition, never asking for titles. Just there, day in, day out. A former military architect turned home renovator, he'd once told Rowan legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you leave behind when no one's looking. I exhaled slowly, then picked up the phone and texted Rowan. When he came home from school, Rowan bounded through the door in his usual way, backpack, half-zipped earbuds hanging, loose sneakers muddy from track practice. "You will not believe what Mr. Graves said about my project." He thought the telescope wasn't real until I showed him the lenses. "Oh, and guess what? We got invited to Grandpa Devereaux's party." I blinked. "How did you Cambria?" texted me. Said there'd be a catered sushi bar and a string quartet. Of course she did. Rowan was 16 tall for his age, with his father's jawline and my stubbornness. He'd only recently started to reconnect with Julian, his biological dad, after years of silence. It had been Julian's idea, actually. A few lunches here, a museum trip there. I'd stayed out of the way mostly. I wanted Rowan to have the option I never did to decide for himself whether someone belonged in his life. "Do you want to go?" I asked. He looked up, face lighting. "Yeah, I think it'd be good." All right then. That night, after Rowan went to bed, I sat on the back porch with Colby and watched the stars blink overhead. The telescope frame they'd built together last summer leaned against the shed, half painted, half loved. "Why do I feel like we're walking into a theater production?" I asked. Colby took a sip of his tea. "Because we are. Just remember, we're not the audience this time. We're the cast that never got written into the script." I rested my head on his shoulder. "I hate how much I still care." "You care because you're human," he said. "But you show up because you're a mother." That was the part that always got me. Not the anger or even the pain, but the care that never really went away. The part that still wanted Rowan to be seen, really seen, not just paraded around when it was convenient. And deep down, maybe I wanted to be seen too, not as the girl Julian married too young or the woman he quietly erased from family photos, but as someone who raised a good boy with love and consistency even if I didn't have a nameplate at the Devereaux estate. The next day I RSVP'd yes. I ordered a navy blue dress that felt elegant but not showy, and Colby pulled out his best blazer. Rowan picked out a burgundy tie that made him look older than 16, but he grinned in the mirror and said, "I'm going to look like someone important." "You already are," Colby said, tying the knot for him. The morning of the event, as we drove up the long, winding road toward the Devereaux estate, I could feel my pulse quicken. White peacocks dotted the manicured lawns. Lanterns hung from the olive trees like ornaments. It was every bit as theatrical as I remembered flawless, expensive, utterly detached from reality. Rowan sat up straighter as the car turned the final corner. "Do you think he'll introduce me to everyone?" I didn't answer right away. Colby reached over, placing a steady hand on Rowan's knee. "You don't need an introduction to belong," and maybe that was true. But as the wrought iron gates opened and we passed through, I had a sinking feeling that belonging, at least here, would always come with conditions. And someone somewhere inside that perfect house was still deciding whether we were family. Or just a footnote. They built that house to impress kings. 12,000 square feet of stone glass and architectural performance perched on a bluff like a crown, every corner perfectly staged. There was even a string quartet rehearsing as we pulled into the circular driveway, the music faint, but precise as if someone had curated the soundtrack to the evening in advance. I'd been here 100 times before, first as Julian's young wife, later as the ex who knew which side gate to use. But this was Rowan's first time since he was 6. He looked out the window wide-eyed, trying to take it all in without looking impressed. As we slowed in front of the valet stand, a boy in a dark blazer approached the car. "Ma'am." He nodded to me, then looked at Colby. "Sir, if you'd like to pull around to the service entrance, we'll park the catering vans behind the garden level." I watched Colby's mouth tighten just slightly. He leaned forward, still in the driver's seat. "We're guests." The boy flushed. I'm sorry, sir." Of course." He opened the rear door for Rowan, stumbling over his own feet. We stepped out together, the three of us, and I felt the eyes before I saw them. A dozen or so guests already mingled on the front lawn under gas heaters and champagne trays. Familiar faces from gala photos and real estate magazines, men in cream sport coats and women with perfect collarbones and even better posture. Conversations floated through the air like curated, fragrant stock portfolios. Aspen slopes and schools that required Latin to graduate. Colby adjusted his blazer. Well, he murmured at least the music's nice. Inside the house was cathedral-level extravagant. Marble floors polished to glass staircases that curved like sculpture and floral arrangements tall enough to cast shadows. They'd redone the interior since I'd last been here, replacing the traditional walnut and velvet with sleek minimalism and curated modern art. I couldn't tell if it was Cambria's influence or Julian's money-chasing relevance. Either way, it felt like a gallery, not a home. A woman with gleaming hair and a clipboard approached. "And you are—" Before I could respond, a voice behind us chimed in. "Mirren." "There you are?" Julian appeared at the top of the stairs, descending like a man who knew he was being photographed. He looked the same, tall, polished, a little too tan for December, as if he'd flown in straight from a golf course in Naples. His smile didn't quite reach his eyes. He reached us, kissed me on the cheek like we were business associates, then turned to Colby and extended a hand. "Thanks for coming, Conrad." "Colby," my husband corrected gently. Julian blinked. "Right. Sorry. Colby." I saw Rowan glance up at Colby just for a second. Julian placed a light hand on Rowan's back. "We're so glad you made it, son. Come, I want you to meet some people." He guided him toward the rear reception room, not even waiting to see if we followed. Colby and I trailed a few steps behind. "Conrad," he whispered to me, amused. "We're getting closer." The main ballroom was flooded with warm light and gold decor, long banquet tables lined with calligraphy place cards and imported roses. A grand staircase framed the room, and overhead hung a chandelier the size of a small car. A Devereaux production, through and through. Julian introduced Rowan to a cluster of men in cufflinks and wool suits. "This is my son," he said with the vague pride of a man unveiling a new investment. "Rowan's gotten into astronomy lately. Very bright." One man nodded politely, then turned back to his drink. Soon after the elder Devereaux arrived, Vivian in navy satin, her hair in a sculpted twist, and Alexander with his usual cane and cufflinks that probably cost more than my car. The room applauded their entrance like a coronation. A photographer trailed behind them, snapping candids that weren't remotely candid. "Mirren," Vivian said as she approached. Her voice was airy, her lips perfectly painted. "So good of you to come. And this must be the husband, Colby," I said, stepping in. "Right, of course." "Lovely to have you both." She turned away before the sentence had fully landed. Rowan was seated next to Alexander at the head table. Technically an honor, though it felt more like placement optics. I watched as introductions began, and Cambria glided into the room like it was hers. She wore pale green, understated but clearly couture, and carried herself with that effortless blend of charm and calculation. She bent down to kiss Vivian, hugged Julian's arm, and began introducing her family, her brother, a tech executive, her sister, a wellness influencer, their parents, retired professors who now ran a philanthropic foundation. Not once did she mention us. We were standing just feet away. Colby held a glass of sparkling water, quietly surveying the room. He didn't need to be told we didn't belong here. He'd sensed it before we walked through the front door. "Cambria looks beautiful," I said quietly, more to myself than anyone. Colby smiled faintly. "So does a diamond in a museum case. Doesn't mean it's warm." I noticed Rowan trying to make conversation with Alexander, talking about a telescope model he and Colby were building, but Alexander turned to a cousin on his other side, and the moment slipped past unnoticed. Colby leaned over to me. "They're trying so hard to impress the room they forgot who they invited." I looked around. He was right. The evening wasn't about family, it was about curation, legacy as performance, belonging as branding. And Colby, despite being the most fatherly man I'd ever known, didn't fit the mold they were trying to cast. Neither did I, and soon I suspected Rowan would feel it too. As servers passed out truffle hors d'oeuvres and another champagne toast was called for some visiting hedge fund friend of Julian's, I looked over at my son, his back straight, his eyes moving from face to face, searching for something familiar. And that's when I saw it just for a flicker. That first crack. The moment when a child starts to understand that sometimes the people who share your blood might never make room for your heart. They toasted the dry-aged beef before they toasted the father of my son. I sat there, clutching my linen napkin with both hands as the room echoed with polite laughter and the gentle clink of crystal against crystal. The string quartet had shifted from Bach to something jazzy and forgettable. Someone's speech had made a joke about cholesterol and legacies, and everyone had found it absolutely delightful. Julian stood now near the center of the long head table. The lights had been dimmed slightly, the room's attention narrowing onto him like a camera lens. He held a flute of champagne perfectly framed by the golden glow of chandeliers. He looked, as always, composed, confident, and about 3 seconds away from quoting Churchill. I've been thinking he began letting his voice drop just enough to make people lean in about the difference between history and destiny. A few appreciative murmurs. For 40 years, my parents have built a legacy rooted in tradition, discipline, and a deep belief in building something that lasts. And tonight, we celebrate that foundation. But we also celebrate what comes next. He turned to Cambria, who gave a small, knowing smile. Sometimes life takes you on detours. Not every journey is linear. Sometimes the first draft needs edits, but eventually you arrive at the version that feels right. That feels true. There was a gentle ripple of laughter across the room. Cambria laughed too, tilting her head just enough to catch the light on her earrings. I watched Rowan's face, trying to decipher the nuance in his father's words. Julian hadn't said anything cruel, but he hadn't said anything kind either. "I want to thank my wife Julian continued, Cambria, you've brought grace, clarity, and an unwavering moral compass to my life. You see me not for my name or my bank account, but for who I really am. And because of you, I've become a better man. Applause followed. Steady, easy, automatic. I didn't move. He turned toward her nephews seated near the center table. And to the next generation, Ben, Luca, Ava, I see so much promise in each of you. You remind me that family is about more than blood. It's about shared vision, shared values. Another round of applause, more spirited this time. The camera flash popped once, twice. I looked at Rowan. He hadn't moved. His expression was neutral, maybe too neutral. The kind of stillness that didn't grow in 16-year-olds naturally. Colby reached under the table and gently squeezed my hand. I hadn't realized I was holding my breath. Julian raised his glass. To legacy. To love and to building something that will outlast all of us. To legacy, the room echoed. I took a sip of water. Colby didn't drink. Rowan kept staring straight ahead, his glass of cider untouched. Cambria stood next. Well, that's hard to follow, she said with a practiced laugh, but I'll try. Her voice had the warm gloss of someone used to handling microphones in crisis PR. She began by thanking Vivian and Alexander for raising a son who doesn't just lead, but listens. She told a story about Julian helping her nieces with homework during a family trip to Vale. She praised the Devereux tradition of mentorship and excellence. And then, like a perfect host, she turned it into a group moment. I think it's easy to look around a room like this and only see the surface money-style status. But what I see, she said, eyes scanning the room like a politician, is intention. I see a family that believes in showing up, in lifting up the next generation, in creating space for each person to become their best self. Applause again. Polite, rhythmic. She smiled and sat. Then Vivian stood. She didn't need a microphone. Her voice, elegant, polished, commanding, carried across the space effortlessly. We are grateful to all of you for joining us tonight, she said. 40 years ago, Alexander and I made a commitment not just to each other, but to building something bigger than ourselves. We built a family, a name, a reputation, and we've watched our children carry that forward. She paused, eyes landing on Julian. Julian, you've always had a restless spirit. It took time, but you found someone who meets you where you are, who understands the rhythm of your mind. Cambria, thank you for seeing our son, for reminding him who he is. Cambria gave a gracious nod, tears welling, just enough for the room to take notice. And to the future, Vivian continued raising her glass. To clarity, to direction, to choosing the right partner, even if it takes more than one try. I felt my jaw tighten. The insult wasn't even sharp. It was smooth, veiled, masterfully crafted. That made it worse. Rowan turned to look at me just briefly. I smiled at him. Not because I wanted to, but because I needed to, because if I didn't, he'd see it all. He turned back to his plate. Colby leaned in close voice, low enough that only I could hear. They'll never say your name, he said. But it's on everything they're afraid of. I blinked, fast. Not tonight, I whispered. Not here. Dinner continued. A slow parade of courses, wine pairings and small talk. But for me, everything after those toasts blurred into static. I watched my son chew, politely nod when spoken to, smile at Cambria's parents when they leaned over to compliment his tie. He was being good, gracious, exactly what this family trained its heirs to be. But I saw it in the way he shifted in his seat, in the way he wiped his hands on the napkin one too many times, in the way he didn't look at Julian again, not even once. Colby caught my eye, his fingers still wrapped around mine beneath the table. I'm fine, I said softly. He shook his head. No, but you will be. And I knew as I looked across that grand room, gold chandeliers, curated smiles, and the glint of ice where warmth should have been, that something was shifting. Not just in me, in Rowan, He'd heard everything, and worse, he'd noticed what wasn't said at all. Every story they told had one thing in common. We weren't in it. By the time the dessert course had been cleared and the servers wheeled out a glistening anniversary cake tall enough to be architectural, I could feel my temples starting to pulse. The evening was now well into its legacy remarks portion, a tradition at every Devereaux milestone event. Julian was back on his feet, standing just a few steps behind his parents, arm-linked effortlessly with Cambria's. They looked polished, framed, like the centerpiece of a dynasty catalog. Julian raised his glass again. As we close out this incredible evening, he began, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge what makes a family endure, not just wealth or power, but unity, shared purpose, shared values. I watched Rowan from the corner of my eye. His shoulders were pulled tight, his jaw set just enough to signal focus, but his hands, folded neatly in his lap, twitched slightly at the fingers. Julian gestured broadly toward the crowd. It's been said that legacy is built over generations. And I look around this room at Cambria's family, at our nieces and nephews, at friends who have become as close as blood, and I see the next chapter already writing itself. He looked toward Cambria's side of the room. We see your brilliance, your creativity, your drive. You carry our name with integrity and vision, and we are proud, so proud of what you're becoming. Another round of applause. Another smile from Cambria that looked like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. No mention of Rowan. Rowan, who had been the one person actually born into the name Julian, was so eager to assign elsewhere. Colby beside me didn't move, but I saw the way he shifted his weight. Not defensive, not angry, just aware, present in a way only he ever seemed to be when it really counted. Cambria took the mic next. Julian and I often talk about how lucky we are to be surrounded by people who reflect the best of us. This evening has been a reminder that family isn't just biology, it's energy, it's intention. I bit the inside of my cheek. Behind us, two women whispered across their glasses of Prosecco. Is that the Devereaux boy over there? Where the one next to Alexander? The teenager. Oh, really? He doesn't look like one. I felt the air leave my lungs before I even realized I'd been holding it. Rowan was seated just a few feet from the podium directly beside his grandfather. But Alexander hadn't spoken to him all evening. Not once. Not during the seafood course, not during the toast, not during the let's take a family photo scramble where Cambria's nieces were summoned to the front, and Rowan stood in the shadows. He wasn't reacting. Not outwardly. His expression stayed steady neutral like it had the night Julian forgot Colby's name. But I knew that face. That's the face Rowan used when something hurt too much to admit out loud. He pushed a slice of strawberry from the edge of his plate with a fork. He wasn't eating anymore. He hadn't been for a while. And still, no one noticed. No one except us. I felt my body stiffen. A part of me wanted to stand, to interrupt, to say, actually, the boy you're ignoring is the only real Devereaux child in this room, but I didn't. Because that would have been about me, and tonight wasn't supposed to be. It was Colby who put a hand lightly on my arm, grounding me. His thumb brushed against the inside of my elbow, not a word exchanged between us. But it worked. He always knew how to meet the moment with calm. Still, my chest ached. I looked back to Rowan, his eyes unfocused, now drifting. I knew he wasn't hearing the speeches anymore. He was somewhere else entirely. And in my mind, I knew exactly where he'd gone. To a garage on a rainy Saturday last spring, to the smell of sawdust and acrylic paint and the sound of a radio humming classic rock in the background. He'd been working on his science fair model, an old satellite replica, for the school's STEM showcase. He wanted the dish to rotate to feel real, he'd said. And when the first motor wouldn't turn, he sat on the floor defeated until Colby walked in holding a screwdriver in one hand and a juice box in the other. You're thinking like a designer, Colby had said. But Tonight, you need to think like an engineer. They spent 4 hours adjusting the joints, rewiring the little gear track, repainting the base. At the end of the night, when the dish finally spun in place, Rowan lit up like he'd landed on the moon himself. Colby never bragged, never posted, never sent a video to a family group chat. He just helped Rowan clean the brushes, packed the leftover parts in a shoebox, and said, "You built something worth showing. That's what matters." That moment had been legacy. Not this dinner, not this performance. That quiet night in our garage had shaped Rowan more than any of Julian's speeches ever could. And now, across this sea of monogrammed napkins and curated centerpieces, Rowan sat alone inside a crowd, shrinking inch by inch, not from rejection, but from invisibility. I couldn't take it anymore. "I need some air," I whispered to Colby. He nodded, once his hand resting briefly at the small of my back as I rose from the table. Outside, the air had cooled. The garden was dimly lit with Edison bulbs strung between trimmed topiaries. I walked along the stone path away from the noise past the koi pond, where guests occasionally smoked or made phone calls under the illusion of privacy. I stopped beneath an arbor, leaned against the frame, and looked back toward the house. Through the wide, paneled windows, I could see them all laughing, clinking glasses, telling stories that wouldn't include us. At the corner of the room, Rowan's chair sat still. His shoulders were hunched now. He stared at the tablecloth. I thought about going back in. Instead, I stood there, letting the cold settle around me like armor. I didn't cry. Not then. Not yet. But something in me hardened. Because I knew after tonight, after this slow dissection of belonging, that something had shifted in my son. A small but irreversible understanding. That sometimes the hardest part isn't being left out, it's being erased before you ever got the chance to be seen. The garden air clung to my skin, cool and fragrant, but not enough to steady me. Through the wide glass windows of the ballroom, the night's theater played on applause in waves, laughter in curated bursts, polished voices repeating the same themes of legacy, unity, tradition, words that meant everything and nothing all at once. I stood still under the arbor, listening from a distance, watching the figures through glass as if they were actors behind a soundproof screen. And then I saw him, Rowan, still seated, his chin in his hand, shoulders stooped ever so slightly forward, a boy trying very hard not to disappear. Colby found me 5 minutes later. He didn't say anything at first, just slipped beside me and offered a hand warm and firm. I squeezed it and let my breath go slow. We stood like that for a few moments until the sound of silverware quieted and the lights inside dimmed slightly for coffee and dessert. I brought him a cider, Colby said. Figured he'd rather have that than whatever they're pouring now. I looked up. Did he say anything? He shook his head. No, but I think he's listening harder than anyone in that room. We walked back in together, slipping quietly past the chatter and candlelight. I returned to my seat. Colby, true to form, didn't sit down right away. He made his way to Rowan with a quiet ease, placing a chilled glass of sparkling cider in front of him like it was the most natural thing in the world. No fuss, no performance. Rowan looked up, eyes a little glassy, but not from tears he hadn't cried. Not yet. His mouth twitched at the corner, the start of a thank you smile, and Colby just patted his shoulder gently before returning to his chair beside me. The program continued. Julian's cousin stood to tell a story about a childhood ski trip. Cambria's father spoke next, referencing Aristotle branding and something about vision. I barely heard any of it. My eyes were on Rowan. He hadn't touched the cider yet. He was holding his phone thumb, hovering over the screen. His brows were slightly furrowed, his posture controlled. Not rigid, not slouched, just held, contained. Then, slowly, he began to scroll. I couldn't see the screen, but I knew what he was looking at. I'd seen those photos on his lock screen, his favorites folder printed and taped on his bedroom mirror in different seasons. The shot of Colby, crouched in the driveway measuring plywood for the telescope frame. The one where Colby had glitter stuck in his beard from helping Rowan build a diorama. And the candid from last summer, Colby, laying back on a plaid blanket, arm behind his head, pointing up at the stars while Rowan held a notepad in his lap. Rowan stopped scrolling. He stared at a photo. I couldn't tell which one, but whatever it was, it rooted him. His thumb froze. His chest rose once deep, then again slower. I watched as his face changed. It hardened first, just subtly. The way your face closes off when you've made peace with being overlooked. But then just as quickly it softened. The way it does when you realize someone did see you all along and has been showing you in quiet, ordinary ways. Colby leaned over to refill his water. He didn't look at Rowan. He didn't need to. Across the room, Cambria was laughing at something Vivian had said. The photographer circled again, taking staged candids that would be filtered, posted, tagged. The Devereaux were still deep in their spotlight. But Rowan wasn't looking at them anymore. He set his phone down, picked up his cider, and took a sip. Then, with the calm of someone far older than 16, he reached for the delicate dessert spoon beside his plate. Not to eat, he didn't touch the cake. He used the spoon to gently tap the edge of his glass. Once, twice, 3 soft chimes. The room hushed in layers, conversations trailing off as people turned toward the unexpected sound. At first, there were a polite, curious smiles. Someone assumed it was another toast. Maybe a young cousin trying to be cute. But then they saw who it was. Rowan stood slowly, but with purpose. He adjusted his jacket the way Colby had taught him before his first school debate. He held the cider flute in one hand, the other resting by his side. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't fumble. He just began. If we're raising glasses, he said, his voice even but resonant, I'd like to add one more. The room paused. Even the string quartet stopped playing. My heart climbed into my throat. Julian turned toward him, brows knitting. Cambria straightened in her seat. Vivian leaned forward ever so slightly. And across the table, Colby didn't blink. He just watched quiet and still, as if he'd always known this moment would come. Rowan took another breath. I've been listening tonight. About legacy. About who matters. About which names make a family strong. He looked around slowly, his gaze sweeping across the guests. But I think we forgot someone. He looked directly at Colby. And I swear, just for a second, the whole world narrowed to the space between father and son. He didn't give me his last name, Rowan said, but he gave me something better. He gave me his time, his patience, his stories. He built me my first telescope by hand when I thought I was too small to be trusted with tools. He sat outside with me in the cold and taught me how to find the North Star. He doesn't have a title in this family, but he's earned something else. Rowan raised his glass. His voice didn't crack once. To the man who showed up, who never needed recognition to lead, who never needed applause to love, Colby Ainsley. Silence. Not a gasp, not a clap, just silence, but not empty. The kind of silence that means something's shifted, something deep. Colby didn't move. He just looked at Rowan with the kind of quiet pride that doesn't need words. I couldn't breathe. And Julian sat frozen, still, like someone realizing they'd missed the only performance that actually mattered. He didn't raise his voice. He raised the room. For a moment, after Rowan finished tapping his glass, I think everyone assumed it was going to be cute. Maybe a polite nod to his grandparents or something Cambria had coached him on. He was, after all, 16. A Devereaux by blood, seated beside the patriarch, wearing the name like a badge none of them expected him to know how to wield. But when he stood straight-backed, calm, steady, and let his eyes land on Colby before speaking, the entire temperature in the room shifted. If we're raising glasses to those who shaped us, he said, voice clear, but even then I'd like to speak about someone who shaped me more than anyone in this room probably realizes. No one moved. The waitstaff froze by the espresso station. The photographer lowered her camera. Even the string quartet, sensing something unscripted, stopped mid-rest. Julian tilted his head, slightly confused. Cambria blinked, still in hostess smile mode, but starting to sense something wasn't right. Rowan's hands didn't tremble. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't reading off a note card. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. I've heard a lot tonight about legacy, he continued, and about what it means to carry a name, but for me, legacy isn't about money or real estate or a string of board positions. He glanced down at his glass, then back up. It's about moments, small ones, like the first time I built something with my hands and someone believed I could. Like staying up past midnight to finish a model because someone sat beside me and didn't let me quit. Like standing in the cold backyard wrapped in 2 blankets while someone adjusted the lens of a telescope he built by hand. Just so I could see Saturn's rings. Silence. I gripped my napkin tightly, holding it in my lap like it could anchor me. Rowan turned, then slowly fully, and faced Colby. He didn't give me his last name. He didn't have to. He gave me the sky. He gave me curiosity. He gave me consistency. He showed me what strength sounds like when it's quiet, when it just shows up every day without needing a spotlight. Colby sat still. Absolutely still, except for the slow rise of his chest and the way his eyes had started to glisten, not from surprise, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe, or quiet heartbreak breaking open in reverse. Rowan looked around the room now, not in challenge, just in truth. He's the reason I know who I am. He didn't ask to be called Dad, but he earned it. And I'm proud, so proud, to share that word with him. He lifted his glass. To Colby Ainsley, the father who didn't need blood to be family. It was a toast, but no one repeated it. Not right away. The room sat in stunned stillness, 100 people blinking at a truth they hadn't expected to hear, and some of them, I think, not fully understanding what they'd just witnessed. Julian didn't move. His mouth was slightly parted, his eyes fixed on Rowan with an expression I couldn't quite name. Cambria had turned toward him as if to ask, "Do something?" But Julian's hands were still at his sides, clenched lightly, unsure whether to reach or retreat. Across the table, Vivian's face remained politely composed, but her knuckles wrapped around her champagne stem had gone pale. And then, at the far end of the room, someone clapped. It was soft at first. 1, 2, 3 beats. A man I vaguely recognized from past fundraisers, an old friend of Alexander's, clapped once more, then nodded. And slowly, almost reluctantly, a few others joined in. Not a roar of approval, not polite obligation. Something slower, heavier, like the acknowledgement of a line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. Colby still hadn't moved. He was blinking now once, twice the way he does when he's trying to keep something from falling. Rowan sat back down without flourish. He didn't look to see who clapped. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. I glanced at Colby. One tear had broken loose and slid down the corner of his cheek. He wiped it with the edge of his sleeve, his eyes never leaving Rowan. And I just sat there, clutching that napkin like it was made of steel. Across from us, Julian finally reached for his glass and took a sip mechanically, like someone drinking water after a blow. He didn't look at Rowan or at me. He didn't say a word. Cambria whispered something in his ear, too low for me to hear. He didn't respond. Vivian began to adjust her seating position, looking down the table as if trying to find a new thread to pull the evening back together. But it was Alexander the patriarch who broke the silence next, not with a speech, but by gently placing his hand on Rowan's shoulder. No words, just that. The room remained quiet after that. The energy had shifted, and no amount of catered desserts or carefully rehearsed toasts could undo it. Something had been said, something that couldn't be unsaid. Later, when the waiters resumed service and the music crept back in like a hesitant tide, People returned to their conversations, but they were quieter, more thoughtful. Like they knew they'd missed something important, but weren't quite sure what it meant. Colby finally looked at me. He didn't speak, just leaned over and pressed his forehead against mine for a second. And that was when I knew whatever happened next, whatever damage control or private fury might come from the Devereaux Rowan had made his choice. Not with drama, not with rebellion, just with truth. And once spoken aloud, it echoed louder than any last name ever could. I didn't plan to share this tonight, but my son deserves better than silence. Colby's voice didn't rise above the room. He didn't clear his throat or ask for attention. He just stood slowly, calmly, and the moment he did, the air shifted again. Subtle, but immediate. People who had returned to their wine looked up. Conversations trailed off. Even those who had been pretending to check their phones now froze eyes following the quiet man in the navy blazer who had, until now, existed only as a background character to the Devereaux performance. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and pulled out a simple white envelope. It wasn't monogrammed or gold-edged or wax-sealed, just a regular envelope worn at the corners from being carried too long. He held it in both hands for a second, almost like he was weighing whether to keep going. Then he nodded more to himself than to anyone else. "I was going to give this to Rowan next spring," he said, voice steady. "At his graduation dinner, somewhere quiet, just us. But tonight, after hearing what he said and after watching what he's endured with grace and strength far beyond his years, I think now is the right time." He opened the envelope and unfolded the first set of papers. "These are the finalized adoption documents, filed and approved by the state court last August." A small ripple moved through the room, not dramatic, just a tightening of posture, a collective breath. Vivian shifted in her seat. Cambria whispered something to Julian again, but Julian didn't respond. Rowan didn't move at all. Colby glanced toward him, eyes soft. "Your mother and I wanted you to know officially, legally and always, that you belong, that you have a father who isn't going anywhere, and not because of a name, but because of love, because of choice." He folded the papers carefully and set them on the table in front of Rowan. Then he lifted another document from the envelope, thicker this time, bound at the corner. "And this," he said, holding it slightly higher, "is the charter for a trust fund I started in Rowan's name. The Ainsley Legacy Fund." There was a murmur. Someone near the center of the room let out a surprised exhale. Colby didn't react. He simply continued, unshaken. "It's a private fund, not connected to any family business, not tied to anyone's estate. It's for your education, your future, or your first moon launch, if you're still into that kind of thing." He smiled then, just slightly, and for the first time that night, Rowan smiled back. Colby finished simply, "You've never needed to earn your worth, but I wanted to make sure you never have to wonder if you're wanted. You are. And you always will be." He sat back down. No fanfare, no bow. Just a quiet return to his seat beside me. The room was still, not in shock exactly, but in something close to awe. Uncle Harold, one of Julian's father's older brothers, slowly stood from his table. He was in his 70s, wiry and sharp-eyed, known in the family for being the one who spoke too bluntly at reunions and didn't care much for curated company lines. He raised his glass. "We've spent a lot of time tonight toasting legacy," he said, looking directly at Julian and then at Colby. "But maybe we forgot what legacy actually means." He turned toward Rowan now. "Kid, you've got a damn fine head on your shoulders. And if you ever build that moon thing, let me know. I've still got a telescope from 1963. You're welcome to restore." A few quiet chuckles. Someone at the other table began to clap. Then another. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. I watched Rowan look around the room, not seeking approval, not tracking responses, just absorbing it. He wasn't performing. He wasn't hungry for their validation. He'd already made his choice. And it showed. Cambria looked distinctly uncomfortable now, her fingers tugging at the hem of her gown. Vivian kept her face composed, but she hadn't touched her champagne since the adoption papers were laid on the table. Julian just stared. Not at Colby, not even at Rowan. At the center of the table, eyes unfocused like someone who'd lost a game they didn't realize had started. Colby leaned over to me and said quietly, "That envelope's been sitting in the glove box for 3 weeks. I wasn't sure I'd use it." "You did more than use it," I whispered back. "You anchored him." Rowan reached for the papers with both hands. He didn't read them right away, he just held them. And I saw it, plain as day, the way his shoulders settled, the way his breath finally came full. Not because someone gave him power, but because someone gave him permanence. And in a room built for names, for brands, for inherited pride, a boy who had been ignored most of the night had just redefined the very thing they claimed to celebrate. Legacy. Not as possession, but as presence. The cracks didn't roar. They whispered, but they were everywhere now. After Colby sat back down, the energy in the room didn't bounce back. Not the way it usually did. The music hadn't resumed. No one called for another toast. The lights felt too bright, the room too exposed, like someone had pulled back a curtain and no one quite knew what to do with the view. I saw Cambria lean in toward Julian, her voice low but urgent. "You should have said something earlier," she murmured. "You should have." Julian didn't answer. His jaw flexed once. His eyes hadn't left the adoption papers on the table. Vivian, always the fixer, always the pivot point, tried to smooth the silence. She stood with her glass raised halfway and said with a smile too crisp to be real, "Well, what a beautiful expression of love and inclusion. It's clear this evening has touched many hearts." But no one lifted their glasses this time. A few polite smiles, a cough, chairs shifting. The room had moved past her and she hadn't noticed yet. Then Alexander stood, slowly. He didn't reach for a glass. He didn't raise his voice. But when he spoke, people listened. The boy reminded us what love looks like. He said his voice a little weathered but firm. Let him speak. Vivian sat down, her posture still poised, but her face had blanched a shade lighter. Julian finally blinked. I watched him look toward his father just briefly, and I couldn't tell if what passed between them was resentment, surprise, or recognition, maybe all three. It was strange watching that family come undone without anyone yelling, without anyone flipping a table. The unraveling was quieter than that, colder. It was in the stillness, in the way guests started whispering differently now, in the way people began noticing Colby. 2 women from the foundation board approached him hesitantly. One had sat on a school board with me. Years ago, always too busy to remember my name. "I just wanted to say," she said softly to Colby, "what your son said tonight." "That was extraordinary." Colby gave a modest nod. "Thank you." Another man approached from behind the finance guy Julian had introduced earlier. "Your boy's got presents," he said to Colby. "Sharp, too. Astronomy right. That's impressive." Colby smiled lightly. He's always been curious. They spoke as if they hadn't ignored him all night, as if he hadn't been mistaken for the valet overlooked in every toast erased from every introduction. But he didn't take the bait. He didn't puff up or play the hero. He just stood there, polite and gracious, like he'd expected none of it, and didn't need any of it to feel whole. Rowan, for his part, was handling it all like someone twice his age. Guests trickled over, some with vague compliments, some just offering a quiet nod of acknowledgement. He thanked each one calmly, sincerely. No bitterness, no pride, just quiet kindness. And I, for once, let myself step back. I stood just behind him, one hand gently resting on the back of his shoulder like a grounding wire. He didn't lean into it, but he didn't pull away either. Cambria eventually moved to the edge of the room, her smile dimming in 10% increments. She had taken a seat near the fireplace, now staring into the floral centerpiece like she was reviewing a deposition in her mind. Vivian had retreated into small talk with a guest from Savannah. Julian remained at the table. He hadn't touched his drink. He hadn't said a word to Rowan. Uncle Harold passed by us again, giving Colby a brief nod before muttering, "About time someone brought decency back into this house." Then he wandered off toward the bar. Colby looked over at me, his eyes still soft around the edges. "You okay?" I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak yet. From across the room, I caught a woman, someone I'd seen in dozens of Devereaux-hosted fundraisers, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite decode. Pity, admiration, regret. Maybe all three. But she didn't look away. The illusion was breaking, and everyone knew it. The illusion that the Devereaux were the pinnacle of grace and tradition. The illusion that legacy was something you inherited, not something you built. And Rowan, our son mine, and Colby's in every way that mattered, had been the one to crack it open. Not with anger, not with rebellion, but with truth. And the truth didn't need to scream. It only needed to be spoken by someone brave enough to mean it. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is leave without applause. We didn't make an announcement. There was no grand goodbye, no dramatic flourish, just the quiet rustle of fabric as I rose from my chair and reached for my coat. Colby stood at the same time, already helping Rowan with his. It was muscle memory by now, the way he straightened the collar, adjusted. The shoulder seam gave it that final tug that said, "You're a good kid." Rowan didn't ask why we were leaving. He didn't need to. The ballroom buzzed around us in fragments waitstaff, collecting plates, the quartet, softly sliding into a safe, classical piece, guests pretending they hadn't just witnessed a public shift in gravity. But every now and then, I felt eyes flick in our direction. Not malicious, just curious, like we'd become the axis of a new, unspoken story. Cambria caught my eye as we passed. She was seated now, spine straight but face drawn in a way I hadn't seen before. Less polished, less sure. For the first time that night, she didn't smile. She didn't wave. She just looked at me like she was trying to understand a variable in an equation that had shifted without warning. Julian didn't look at us at all. He stayed in his seat, eyes still on the table, hands folded in front of him. A man who had lost control of a room without knowing when it started slipping. As we moved past the coat check, Colby reached into his inner pocket and pulled out the claim ticket. He handed it to the attendant, who recognized us now, who made eye contact. This time, offered a small, genuine, "Thank you for coming," and passed our coats over without asking whose name was on the list. We stepped outside into the cold. The air felt sharper, cleaner somehow. No more music, no more toasts. Just the sound of gravel crunching beneath our feet as we made our way to the car. Rowan slid into the back seat and exhaled the way you do when you've been holding something in all night and finally let it go. Colby started the engine. For a while, no one spoke. We just drove past the glowing hedges through the wrought iron gates onto the dark, two-lane road that led back to where things felt real. The silence wasn't heavy. It was whole. I looked out the window at the tree branches, bare against the winter sky, and thought about all the ways this night could have gone. All the versions of me that had rehearsed sharp words, well-timed exits, verbal reckoning. None of them had shown up. Instead, we'd watched our son tell the truth, and that had been enough. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Then Colby glanced at Rowan in the rearview mirror. "Want to finish the telescope tonight?" Rowan didn't hesitate. "Let's point it at Jupiter." A small smile passed between them. The kind you don't need to explain. Colby reached over and turned the radio dial until it landed on a jazz station, one of those smooth late-night programs that always sounded like someone playing from a rooftop in the distance. I rested my hand on his knee and leaned my head against the window. It was over. Not the damage, not the family mythology, not the ways we'd always be tethered to that name. But the performance. The need to prove. The need to belong to a room that had never intended to make space for us. They could keep the chandeliers and the curated lineages and the speeches about shared vision. We had something else. We had a garage waiting with parts still laid out, a telescope half assembled, a backyard with just enough sky left to find the rings of Jupiter, and a boy who had stood up in a room full of people who hadn't seen him and made them listen. We didn't need a toast to mark the moment. We had each other, and that was the exit worth remembering. He boxed every gift, even the one with his initials engraved. The next morning, the house was quiet. Not solemn, not tense, just quiet in that particular way Sunday mornings tend to be when something significant has passed and the air is slowly returning to normal. I stood in the kitchen sipping coffee, watching the light shift across the floor as it filtered through the window blinds. In the distance, I could hear faint rustling from Rowan's room drawers, opening tape being pulled, cardboard flaps folding shut. He hadn't said much when we got home the night before, just night and a tired half-smile as he disappeared upstairs. But I saw the way his posture had changed lighter somehow, unburdened. Now, as I placed 2 slices of bread in the toaster, he emerged from the hallway carrying 2 boxes stacked in his arms. They weren't heavy, but they were full. Gift bags poked out from the top, ribbons, wrapping paper. I recognized one of the items immediately, the navy monogrammed sweater from Vivian, still in its tissue paper, never worn. "I'm heading to the STEM Center," Rowan said, setting the boxes by the door. "Figured the kids could use this stuff." I blinked. "All of it." He nodded. "Yeah, I don't really need 5 leather-bound journals with my initials on them or a silver telescope I can't touch because it's decorative." He said the last part with air quotes, and it made me smile, despite myself. Colby walked in still barefoot, rubbing the back of his neck. "You sure about this?" he asked, motioning toward the boxes. Rowan shrugged. "They'll get more use out of it than I will." There was no bitterness in his voice, no defiance, just clarity. I walked over and touched the top box. "Do you want us to come with you?" He shook his head. "Nah, I've got it." He bent down and retrieved a small envelope from the front pocket of his jacket. "I emailed Granddad last night too, and Julian." He hesitated for just a second. Just said thank you for the gifts. And that I hope they're okay with me giving them to someone who'll actually enjoy them. I raised my brows. "That was generous." He gave a soft smile. "I didn't say it to be generous. I said it to be clear." He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door and headed out to the car. Colby and I stood there for a long moment after he left. The silence wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence you only get when someone you love makes a decision so rooted in self-worth it echoes louder than any argument ever could. Later that afternoon, I peeked into Rowan's room, clean as usual. Not sterile, but lived in with intention. On his desk sat one thing, the telescope frame he and Colby had finished assembling just before dinner the night before. It hadn't even been painted yet, but there was something proud in the way it stood, like it knew it had a purpose. On the bookshelf next to his bed was a small framed photo. Colby and Rowan both laughing, covered in sawdust, holding up a jagged piece of pine with a ruler wedged in it. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't meant to be. But it was theirs. Colby knocked lightly on the doorframe behind me. "Any reply?" he asked. I shook my head. "Nothing yet." He nodded like he'd expected that. We went back to the kitchen, and a few minutes later, Rowan returned, coat open cheeks, pink from the wind car keys in hand. "How'd it go?" Colby asked. "They were setting up for a rocket workshop," Rowan said. "Some of the kids looked around 10. One of them started freaking out over the astronomy books. He didn't even notice the gift tag still had my name on it. "And Julian?" I asked gently. Rowan walked to the fridge, grabbed a bottle of apple juice, and took a long sip before answering. No reply. Not even a red receipt. Colby didn't speak. Neither did I. Rowan put the juice back turned. and leaned against the counter with his arms folded. That's okay, though. He smiled again, different this time. Not polite. Not for us. I know who I am, he said, and I know who sees it. There was nothing left to say. Not in that moment. Because that was it, that was the shift. The quiet claim of identity that didn't ask for permission or forgiveness or validation. He didn't need his father's approval. He didn't need the Devereaux name to shine. He'd found his gravity. And standing there under our kitchen's hum of normalcy, Rowan looked taller than he ever had. Not physically, not suddenly older, but anchored, fully his. I reached out and ran my hand once through his curls the way I used to when he was small. He didn't flinch. He let me. Colby smiled at him, pride without spectacle. Rowan grinned. Can we paint the telescope tomorrow? Colby raised a brow. What color are we talking? Midnight blue, with gold flecks for the stars. Sounds like legacy, Colby said. Rowan laughed. Sounds like mine. They said legacies were built in boardrooms, but I watched one built in a backyard. 2 days after the party, we finally had clear skies. The cold had crisped the air, and the last of the fall leaves clung to the trees like little golden flags. Colby and Rowan were already outside when I stepped onto the back porch, bundled in sweaters, their breath curling visibly with every laugh. The telescope stood proudly in the center of the yard, its midnight blue frame gleaming faintly under the porch light. Rowan had insisted on painting it himself, with Colby supervising, of course. Tiny gold flecks dotted the sides, uneven and imperfect, but twinkling just enough to feel like stars. I brought out 2 mugs of cocoa and handed them off before quietly pulling my phone from my coat pocket. I didn't say anything, just stood there for a moment and watched as Colby gently adjusted the angle of the telescope, his hand on Rowan's shoulder as they aligned it with the night sky. Try it now, Colby said, stepping aside. Rowan leaned down, eye to lens, and after a pause that stretched longer than it needed to, he exhaled. There it is. His voice was reverent. Saturn. I can see the rings. Colby smiled, not proud, in the way men sometimes are when they've built something, but proud. In the way fathers are when they have stayed long enough to witness the results. That was when I took the photo. Just the 2 of them silhouetted against the night. Colby's hand still resting on Rowan's back, the telescope, angled upward stars overhead. There wasn't a spotlight, no plaque, no curated caption, but I knew right then this was the legacy. Later that night, after Rowan had gone inside and Colby was coiling up an extension cord, I slipped back into the house and pulled out an old photo from the junk drawer. It was curled at the corner, slightly stained, and it made me smile every time. Rowan had been maybe 7 in it, standing in the garage with safety goggles too big for his face, holding up a crooked cardboard telescope model. Colby knelt beside him, wearing a paint-splattered hoodie, laughing at something just out of frame. Rowan's curls stuck out in every direction, and Colby had a glue stick in one hand, like a trophy. The frame I chose wasn't fancy, just a simple wooden one we'd had in a storage bin for years. I placed the photo inside and carried it out to the small shed Colby had converted into a backyard observatory. It wasn't much, just an old tool shed with new insulation, a space heater, and a skylight he'd carved himself, but it was theirs. I placed the frame on the shelf above the observation chair next to a row of astronomy books and a small labeled drawer of telescope parts. The image didn't need a spotlight. It didn't need to be posted. It just needed to live where legacy was actually built, in quiet spaces, on cold nights, where love showed up again and again without a title, without applause, without asking to be seen. You don't choose the family you're born into, but you can choose the one that shows up. That's what I keep thinking now, days later, as I sit under the dome of our small backyard observatory, just me, the telescope, and the wide waiting sky. For years, I thought family was something fixed, A name printed on letters, a seat assigned at a long table, a story someone else had already written and handed you to memorize. I thought it came with photo albums and monogrammed sweaters and words like legacy tossed around like centerpieces. And for a long time, I thought I was lucky to be near that kind of story, even if I wasn't exactly in it, even if I stood just outside the frame. But something shifted the night I raised that glass, not just in the room, in me. That was the moment I stopped waiting for someone else to claim me and started claiming myself. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was real. The truth is, I don't remember what most people said that night. I don't remember the fancy beef or the wine or whatever speech Julian was halfway through when I tuned out. What I do remember is the weight of the cider flute in my hand. The way the room got so still I could hear my own breath. The way Colby didn't blink when I spoke, like he'd been waiting for me to say those words, not for him, but for myself. And I remember what happened after. The quiet ride home. The soft thud of the cardboard boxes as I packed those gifts with my name stitched into things I would never wear. The look in Mom's eyes when I said I don't need them. I already have what matters. That telescope, painted midnight blue flecked with uneven stars, now stands in our backyard like a monument to everything we built together. Every late night. Every question he didn't laugh at. Every trip to the hardware store just because I wanted to change the lens mount. Colby never made a show of it. He never called it fatherhood. But it was. Last night I called him Dad, just like that. No warning, no ceremony. He was tightening a screw on the base plate and I handed him the wrench and said, "Here, Dad?" He looked up, startled for a second. Then he smiled. Not the kind you put on for other people, but the kind that settles deep in your chest. The kind you remember when the sky is quiet and your throat aches for no reason. We didn't talk about it. We didn't have to. Tonight, we rolled the telescope out again. The backyard was cold but clear. Jupiter was just starting to rise low and gold in the sky with its faint banding barely visible to the naked eye. I held the base steady while Colby adjusted the lens careful and practiced like always. Then he stepped back and nodded for me to look. I bent down, pressed my eye to the eyepiece, and everything else disappeared. There it was. Rings Moon's light that had traveled longer than my name had ever meant anything. And that's when I knew, not just in my head, but in my bones, that legacy isn't something you're handed. It's something you build. In garages, in backyards, in moments no one else ever sees. A few feet away on the observatory shelf sits a photo from years ago. Me age 7, covered in glitter and glue, holding up a crooked telescope frame with Colby beside me grinning like we'd won the lottery. No one ever printed that picture in a newsletter. No one ever toasted it. But it hangs right above the desk now. Not because it needs to be seen, but because I see it. That's the thing about stars. They don't need a spotlight. They reflect what's already there. They burn quietly and constantly long before anyone notices. And the ones that matter most, they never ask to be named. They just show up. Every night, like he did, like he still does.